Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us in our third installment of our webinar series. Today's topic is a human rights-based approach to sexual assault supports. My name is Kara McCaskill. I'm the Sexual Assault Resource Coordinator with the Women's Resource Center.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mia Bastian. I'm the Director of Operations and Development at the Women's Resource Center.
Just a warning before we get started, some of the content you're about to hear may be a little bit upsetting for some people, so please practice good self-care and step away if you need to. And we'd also like to acknowledge that the Women's Resource Center is located on Treaty 2 territory, and we also operate on Treaty 1 territory, which are the lands of the Anishinaabeg, Cree, Oji-Cree, Assiniboine, Dakota, and Dene peoples, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation. So I guess to start us off, we'll just talk a little bit about what a human rights-based approach is. So a human rights-based approach is one that is grounded in upholding, centralizing the principles, norms, and standards of international human rights architecture and domestic human rights architecture. So the human rights-based approach is grounded in what we call the International Bill of Rights. So those are three United Nations documents, the first being the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the second being the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the third being the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. These three foundational documents kind of outline very broadly what human rights people have, what states' responsibilities are, how people can go about claiming rights, and holding states accountable for not meeting their obligations. The human rights-based approach is also kind of necessitates the presence of what we call duty bearers versus rights bearers. So rights bearers is all of us. We are all rights bearers, individual people. We are all rights bearers. We all have the ability to lay claim to our human rights. And duty bearers are those who have an obligation to uphold those rights. So on the international level, that would be states, governments, international groups, and on the domestic level, that would be more like local governments or local groups. And they all subscribe to this human rights-based approach that's grounded in this International Bill of Rights and also based on the four basic principles of human rights. The first being universality, which means that human rights apply to everyone, all of us, regardless of any extenuating circumstances. Inalienability, meaning that human rights can't be taken away, either voluntarily or not. Indivisibility, which means that all human rights are equally valuable and should all be upheld. And interdependence, meaning that the recognition of one human right necessitates the recognition of all other human rights. So we've kind of talked a lot about the international human rights architecture, but it's actually evolved quite a lot to be domestic as well. So we have our own human rights architecture, which would include things like the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, various provincial bills of human rights or human rights codes, and various provincial victims' bills of rights. So when we're taking a human rights-based approach in Canada, we're not only relying on the international human rights architecture, we're also relying on our own domestic human rights architecture and kind of combining the two. And to do that, we rely on those very specific aspects to a human rights-based approach. So those would include things like valuing the participation of all stakeholders and citizens, aiming to empower, basing our recommendations for a human rights-based approach on local context and need. So not kind of creating this cookie cutter approach that can kind of be cut and paste across different jurisdictions, that we're really paying attention to what the local needs are and what the local context is. A human rights-based approach also values providing space for analysis and evaluation and accountability measures, as it's really, really important to be able to grow our human rights-based approach to adapt it as things shift and change. And of course, the kind of the foremost aspect of a human rights-based approach is helping rights holders to claim their rights and for duty bearers to understand their obligations. So there is quite a significant educational aspect to it as well. That's really, really important. And now we're going to do just a very, very brief history of human rights. So we're going to talk a little bit about human rights on an international level, and then we're going to kind of move into human rights law in Canada, just very, very briefly to kind of outline kind of where all these things are coming from and what the origin of these things were. So the League of Nations was kind of like the very first international cooperation effort to recognize human rights. The League of Nations was incorporated in 1920 and continued until 1946. And then the League of Nations was kind of replaced by the United Nations, which is, of course, something that exists today. So the United Nations was founded October 24th, 1945, on the adoption of the United Nations Charter, which set the foundation for the United Nations. And this is something that happened after the San Francisco Conference, which was led by Eleanor Roosevelt, which this was an event that was attended by delegates from all different states. And they all came together to collaborate on what a United Nations would look like, what the job of the United Nations would be. And it was, then founded in October of 1945. There were 51 founding nations, including Canada, and Canada was actually quite instrumental in the initial drafting of the United Nations Charter. And then after the United Nations was founded, we had the implementation of the first part of the International Bill of Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or UDHR, which was adopted in the General Assembly on December 10th, 1948. And this kind of set the foundation for what human rights are, what people had a human right to, and what states' obligations were. And that would be something that would be universally applicable to all member states of the United Nations. And actually now, the day that the UDHR was adopted is now known as Human Rights Day. December 10th every year is celebrated by human rights organizations and states and citizens alike to celebrate the very foundational document that is the UDHR. And Canada has some of our own human rights legislation as well that has been quite influential. It kind of began with the Canadian Bill of Rights in 1960, which was very much in line with what we were seeing across the world at the time of a kind of post-World War II recognition of human rights and wanting to uphold people's human rights. So Canada introduced the Bill of Rights in 1960. That was our kind of first human rights document of that era. And then it was replaced in 1982 by the Charter when we had the repatriation of the Constitution in 1982. And the Charter is actually embedded in our Constitution, which is notable because the Constitution, of course, as our foundational legal document for Canada, cannot be usurped by any other legal instrument. So that means the Charter is upheld above all. And the Charter upholds the human rights that all Canadian citizens have, and kind of outlines things like equality rights and political rights, Indigenous rights, language rights, all those kinds of good things are in the Charter. We've also got various provincial human rights codes. So for example, Ontario was the first province to have their own provincial human rights code in 1961, followed in short order by a slew of other provinces. We have our own human rights code here in Manitoba that Mia is going to talk about a little bit later for us. We've also got victims' bills of rights. There's the federal victims' bill of rights, and provinces also have their own victims' bills of rights, and we have one here in Manitoba as well. So all of these kind of aspects, and these are just examples. Of course, we're likely missing a lot of them, but these are kind of just some examples of the human rights law that we have in Canada for taking a rights-based approach to policy and law in our own country, as kind of premised on the international human rights architecture of the United Nations and some of those other international documents that we've already spoken a little bit about. So given that the international architecture of human rights arose kind of post-World War II in an effort to ensure that people's human rights were protected, we kind of saw the rise of what's called a rights-based approach, which I mentioned right at the beginning is an approach that values and serves to uphold and centralize the principles, norms, and standards of human rights. So initially, rights-based approaches were very focused on the development side of things. So scholarship, nonprofits, people working in the field that were taking a rights-based approach were very focused on international development work. But since then, human rights in general has evolved. The framework of a human rights-based approach itself has evolved, and we've seen the human rights-based framework has been adapted to be used with a variety of sectors, including healthcare, gender, law, criminal justice, social service provision, and sexual and reproductive health, for example. And speaking of gender and a human rights-based approach, the very kind of first, or one of the first explicit acknowledgements in writing at an international level of women's rights, gender equality rights was in the Vienna Declaration of 1993, which was a very important development for taking a rights-based approach to gender. And we've also done some things here in Canada to take a human rights-based approach to gender. So one is GBA plus, or gender-based analysis plus, which is an approach to policymaking that the government of Canada takes. So it's related to a human rights-based approach. It's not exactly the same. So for example, while a human rights-based approach aims to incorporate the principles and spirit of human rights as articulated on an international level down into domestic policies and laws, the GBA plus approach aims to analyze how any given policy in any given kind of discipline may be experienced differently by someone due to gender or other intersecting factors like socioeconomic status, employment, race, religion, all of those kinds of things. So gender-based analysis plus is very much related to a human rights-based approach to gender. Canada has also ratified the United Nations treaty known as CEDAW, so the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which is kind of a mouthful, hence the little acronym there. But essentially, that treaty outlined all of this, the human rights related to gender that citizens could claim. It aimed to reduce the amount of violence against women, reduce the amount of discrimination against women. It also outlined the obligations that states have to uphold gender equality and to ensure that people are not being discriminated against based on gender. And as we kind of talked about briefly just on the slide before, we also have the Charter here in Canada, and it has a section that incorporates gender. So for example, in the equality rights section of the Charter, section 15.1, every individual is equal before and under the law and has the right to equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination, and in particular, without discrimination based on race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, or mental or physical disability. So a human rights-based approach to gender is very much incorporated into our Charter as well, which of course is the preeminent human rights document in Canada and cannot be usurped. And now linking the human rights-based approach with approaches that are taken to sexual assault services in Canada. Of course, sexual assault is a major human rights violation. Just by way of a few examples, sexual assault is a violation of somebody's charter rights to life, liberty, and security of the person. It's a violation of somebody's rights to health. It's a violation of somebody's equality rights. It's also a violation of somebody's internationally recognized rights to health, equality, security of the person, life, liberty, freedom from torture, freedom from cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment, just to name a few. And some of these rights that are being violated in situations of sexual assault are what we call non-derogable rights. So rights that are never permitted to be violated under any circumstances. So examples of that would be freedom from torture and freedom from cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment. Those are two what we call non-derogable rights, and those rights are never allowed to be violated. And given the indivisibility of human rights, violations are not just limited to the rights mentioned above. I'm sure that I've missed some. These were just by way of an example. And the consequences or after effects of sexual violence may affect other human rights. Because of this indivisibility of human rights, you can't recognize the violation of some without recognizing the violation of others. So for example, After somebody experiences sexual violence, they may experience an inability to work. They may have trouble accessing services that they have a right to. They may have trouble accessing community supports if they've been socially isolated, all those types of things. It can make them difficult. It can make it difficult rather to obtain other types of things that they are entitled by right to. It may also just kind of highlight this indivisibility of human rights and how violations are not just limited to the ones that we've mentioned, and every person's experience is going to be different. So let's talk about what approach to sexual assault is currently being used, because it's not an entirely rights-based approach. So for example, the criminal justice system, which many survivors will access post-sexual assault, not all do, but some do. Sexual assault is considered a crime against the state rather than a crime against the person. And this is just the way that all criminal proceedings in Canada work, where for like the Crown prosecutor is the lawyer for the state. They're not the lawyer for the person. So crimes, all criminal proceedings work this way, and crimes against individual people, if those are going to be prosecuted, they'll be done in a civil court. So all evidence that is collected against an accused in a sexual assault trial, for example, is in service of proving beyond a reasonable doubt, that's the standard that has to be met, that the crime occurred and that the accused is the guilty party. So the criminal justice system, as I'm sure many know, is rife with opportunities for re-traumatization of survivors. They may be re-traumatized during the investigation process. They may be re-traumatized in the courtroom process. They may be re-traumatized if they're called as witnesses to recount their story in front of the court. They may be re-traumatized having to see the accused in court. There's so many ways that the court and criminal justice system may re-traumatize survivors. So in an effort to kind of mitigate that re-traumatization, in some cases, a trauma-informed approach to evidence collection and the criminal justice system in general is taken. And a trauma-informed approach is really important and in line with a human rights-based approach because it recognizes somebody's right to security, equality, health. So it's really important that where possible, we use a trauma-informed approach. And in the criminal justice system, some of the ways that this has been done is changing how survivors are interviewed, changing how evidence is collected. There are some ways that the courtroom setup can be altered to provide a way to kind of mitigate the trauma of the court process. However, in a lot of cases, a trauma-informed approach is not used. This is for a variety of reasons. It could be dependent on what types of training are available in the region, what types of training are required, as in some cases, trauma-informed training is required. It's really important that as a part of a human rights-based approach to sexual assault support, that a trauma-informed approach is taken, although it's not always the case. In the healthcare system, which in situations of sexual assault supports is very much linked with the criminal justice system, many healthcare centers and staff undertake their work with great attention to a trauma-informed approach. But again, others don't. And this is, again, usually dependent on, what kinds of training are available, what the staffing levels look like, things like that. And in some cases in the healthcare system, when survivors present to a healthcare center post-assault, there's also a lot of opportunity for re-traumatization to occur, making it all the more important that a trauma-informed approach is taken. For example, because the evidence in cases of sexual assault is collected to aid the Crown's case on behalf of the state, that's the focus for any kind of forensic exam of the rape kit, and doing that in a way that's trauma-informed is really critical, as that is in line with a human rights-based approach and recognizing the survivor's right to the highest attainable standard of health, recognizing their right to security, their right to equality. And other ways that this is done is providing healthcare services that are for the direct benefit of the survivor and really taking the time to understand what their needs are. So for example, STD testing may be done, pregnancy testing may be done, treatment of any wounds, and potential referrals to other services. And those are all things that can also be done in a trauma-informed way and in a way that involves the survivor and gives them choice. In the social services sector, and when I say social services, I mean things like social work, mental health and wellness services, services that help people with housing or employment. The approach that agencies like that take to their work will depend on what type of agency it is, what type of training that's available to them, what type of training they require, the background of staff. It really, really varies. But at the very least, many are now using a trauma-informed approach to their work, which again would be a part of this human rights-based approach. And some may also use a decolonial or an anti-racist approach. Some may use a feminist approach. So those would also be, of course, in line with a human rights-based approach, recognizing people's right to equality, people's rights to non-discrimination, all those types of things. And lastly, in general society, we know that the perceptions of sexual assault in general society tend to influence kind of the ways that sexual assault is perceived and dealt with in different organizations, in different sectors of professional sectors. Unfortunately, in North America, we are living in a society that is marred by rape culture. And when I say rape culture, I mean a climate where sexual assault, sexual violence are normalized or trivialized. This can be done in a number of ways. It could be done through media representations of sexual assault. It could be done through the jokes that people tell and are not called out on. It could be done through prevailing social attitudes that are not checked, lack of proper education on sexual assault. So unfortunately, we do live in this society that is marred by rape culture, and it does tend to infiltrate the ways that organizations, professions approach sexual assault, as it's just so pervasive in a lot of senses. However, there are lots of examples of where human rights-based approaches have been successfully used. So for example, in the healthcare sector, we have the trauma-informed approach to health that we've already kind of spoken about, and how that is in line with a human rights-based approach. We also have what is called the human rights in patient care approach that many healthcare providers have begun to shift towards. So this is something that focuses on articulating what the rights of patients are, and also what the responsibilities of providers are, so that everybody understands what their role in the healthcare system is and is able to carry it out. Nonprofits have long used human rights architecture as the basis for their work. This has largely been the international human rights architecture via the covenants and treaties of the United Nations. Initially, this would have occurred mainly in nonprofits that were working in the development sector or working internationally. However, as human rights as a whole has evolved, and how human rights in different countries themselves have evolved, these approaches, the human rights-based approaches, have been adapted to a wider range of nonprofits operating in many sectors. So things like the right to food, the right to housing, the right to healthcare are the corners of many nonprofits, and that's based on the human rights architecture internationally and locally. As well in education, so there's kind of two facets to the education piece. So there's the recognition that students have a right to education. There's the recognition that faculty have a responsibility towards students in providing an education equitably in a way that is culturally sensitive, inclusive, accessible, all of those kinds of things. That's something that's gained notice in the last kind of few years and would be very much in line with a human rights-based approach. However, the broader concepts of human rights have also made their way into education at all at all levels. So whereas human rights discussions were happening largely in the university setting or maybe upper years high school, now they're happening at all levels. So teaching very young kids in elementary school ideas on human rights from that young age really speaks to the importance of a human rights framework, and making sure that this is something that's accessible to everybody.
Thank you, Kara. So why is a human rights-based approach to sexual assault useful? Kara had mentioned earlier about our Manitoba Human Rights Code, and to put it in terms of why it's so useful is that a human rights approach is also a trauma-informed approach. It ensures that any kind of service delivery is consistent and that honors the protected characteristics. Our Manitoba Human Rights Code mandate is, quote, to represent the public's interest in eliminating discrimination and ensuring that employers, landlords, and service providers comply with the code. And we know that with the intersectionality of survivors and what it means to not only access services, but what that means is ensuring that service delivery is consistent. And when we say well-established framework on which to map sexual assault, when we're referring people or a survivor to another service provider, we want to ensure that we are honoring that human rights approach and, again, to mitigate risk of discrimination. It mitigates re-traumatization, which is something we want to also ensure as service providers. Globally recognized language of human rights. So we speak of that international level, and we know we have it here at this level of provincially, locally, and at a grassroots level with different organizations. It's something as service providers we are obligated to provide, to ensure that someone who comes to you, not only are you upholding their rights, but also making them aware of their rights when accessing other services. And this can also be in relation to the Manitoba Victim Bill of Rights as well. We find it useful as it does promote growth and change. And we see that advocacy of the human rights approach with one service provider can also create a space of growth and a learning opportunity for other service providers. Kara spoke earlier about the training, and sometimes we see there is this lack of understanding of what that actually means, but we understand that with the human rights approach, it's most effective and efficient, and it protects the dignity of that survivor. And it creates a space of reflection. It provides a place for us to ask questions like, what are our responsibility as an organization? And for the Women's Resource Center, we have adopted the Human Rights Code in how we manage our service delivery, and also how we have our staff and team members also help women navigate in the community as well. When we're creating that map, we want to also see it out upon ourselves to educate when possible. And that really promotes, again, that trauma-informed service delivery that's so integral, and that coexists with the human rights approach that respects the dignity of the survivor. And we see that we want to continue to build trust in these systems. We want, whether someone is accessing our justice system or our healthcare system, unfortunately, there is space, and there has been historically space for discrimination, especially around sexual assault, where a human rights approach is absent or not there or being implemented. And we know if that distrust can build, and with distrust, then we see women or survivors are less likely to report or to seek support, which then again undermines the healing and the justice process. So when we say, why is a human rights approach so important, it's really truly because it permeates through all the interactions, and it promotes effective service delivery and ensures the dignity and safety of that individual. So I spoke about the Victim Bill of Rights and how the human rights-based approach really does honor that. And a lot of the times we're finding that, unfortunately, an individual doesn't know about the Victim Bill of Rights. And again, it's not being honored in different spaces. So that public education piece of what is your right in that space as a victim, as a survivor, and how do we better inform individuals to ensure that they're accessing it, again, through trauma-informed approaches. And, we speak about survivors, but also how do we educate other stakeholders on what this means, and building a human rights-based approach community as we collaborate to ensure that we're delivering that with that same approach. And of course, there's always this commitment to continuous improvement. So what could we do better? And we can work to change how crimes of sexual assault are framed. Kara spoke about the rape culture that permeates frequently, and how do we change that? And I think through having these discussions and understanding and what it entails, greater education on human rights and sexual assault. So having more education from a proactive space, having these discussions, whether in different spaces as well, and knowing that what can help someone else, guiding them. Of course, increase funds for frontline services. As nonprofits, we inherit a lot of different responsibilities as well, and navigating that and ensuring service delivery, adequate service delivery, can sometimes be under threat due to a lack of funding. So what we could always do better is, of course, support organizations in different spaces that are providing a human rights-based approach to sexual assault supports, and fortifying that social safety net, making sure to not work in the silo effect, trying to build relationships as well as service providers, and to ensure that service delivery, especially in this kind of space, and fully committing to international human rights on gender equality. We have various federal and provincial codes that have been adopted from the international level and ratified, and really taking on that space as we move forward of knowing what exactly that means. Reading over the Human Rights Code is so integral, especially as we try to implement this approach to sexual assault support. So moving forward, it's truly about increasing public education, being integral to that space. Thank you.
Thanks, Mia. So that's all we've got for you all today. And of course, we've got all our contact information here, phone, email, my contact information as well. So please feel free to contact us at any time with any questions. And thank you for joining us today.